Hey everyone, Trista here. Many of you know me from my work with Playing for the Planet over the years, and now in my new position as Director of Gaming Sustainability at Microsoft. This is going to be a really fun panel for me because there's no one in the world more that loves nerding out on a complex data question except for my three distinguished guests here. They are the ones that know the ins and outs of the industry numbers and have been actively working with the metrics and tools that will help the game industry move the needle. With me, I have Xiao Wang, Program Officer at UNEP DTU Partnership, Josh Aslan, Energy Policy Analyst at Sony Interactive Entertainment, and Dan Jacobs, Senior Software Engineer and Gaming Sustainability PM at Microsoft. In today's discussion, we are going to take our nose out of the database grindstones and take a few steps back, reflecting with all of you in the audience about where we're at as the industry and also what it's going to take to bring the games industry into alignment with really crucial carbon goals at the planetary level. We're going to cover some frequently asked questions to the data experts, peer support and shared tools, how to get started and where to place that first initial energy, and then what is it we need to come together to do so much more. We're going to start with the first slide, a slide that two different people put up yesterday. It is that really troubling picture of the emissions gap from the UN emissions gap report. And you can see the distance between that yellow line of current planned business, and then there's the pink and green lines that represent the country commitments. But of course, as Sam said yesterday, we really need emissions to basically quickly and aggressively be falling off the cliff. And so that leaves us to the open question from our first panelist. I wanted to ask Xiao Wang. Xiao, what is it going to take for the gaming industry to close its share of this massive emissions gap?
So thank you, Trista. I think we definitely need greater collaborations among the gaming providers, standardization bodies, and the policymakers across entire gaming industries to promote a net zero transition of this industry. And for doing that, I see the leaderships coming from three areas for the industry. And the first one will be the private sector leadership on industry standards making. And these standards should be inclusive. It's not only designed for the big corporations, but also considering the small and medium-sized enterprises to help them develop and ensure they can access the markets for sustainable gaming products and services. And the second leadership I could see is from the public and private partnerships for facilitating the transparency and global benchmarkings. Because what we have seen on the private standards are they are experiencing the challenges of incomparabilities to a lack of transparency. So if we could develop publicly backed private standards, which means to align the public and private standards with global benchmarks that reflect best practices, and that will help us to alleviate the duplications caused by multiplicity and misalignment of existing standards. And the third part, the leadership I could see is from the industrial alliances, that we need the industrial alliances to develop a platform of convergency where we could address the problematic landscape of competing standards. Because the fact of the matter is, many of the audits the companies are doing is very costly. It costs lots of resources, which are not necessarily providing comparable and shareable outcomes. So we need to create a uniform framework with common metrics and measurements so that it could free up some of the resources that could be redeployed to the places where they're needed most. But I want to bring into your attention, to the audience's attention, that such unified framework at the global level, but we also need to consider the local adaptations to secure the local buy-ins for adopting the standards and promoting a better development of the net zero transition for the gaming industry. Back to you.
Xiao, can you comment a bit on the cost of inaction?
I think that's a very good question. So it's very important for people to understand if we don't move to a net zero goal, what could happen? I have some numbers that I could provide for the people. One of the studies, according to the University of Lancaster, so the predictions of the carbon emissions rise of the gaming sector is alarming. So they pretty much did a 3 scenarios study. One is the business as usual; it stays on the gaming sectors, and the second one is a hybrid scenario, which is the cloud gaming is moving into the pictures. And the third one is a cloud dominant scenario, which are 90% of the gamers moving on to the streaming services. And the results they have seen is pretty bleak, because according to this study, the hybrid feature will result in a 30% increase in emissions compared to the business as usual for now, which is not likely that will remain on this path. And in a cloud dominant future, there has seen a 112% increase compared to what we have now. And they have also further concluded, if streaming at 4K resolution becomes widespread, then we will really be game over for all of us. And in terms of the energy use, according to the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, in the cloud dominant scenarios, there would as a 70% more energy overall compared to a gaming, cloud gaming only take 1/5 of the current market. And in the console sectors, as an example, on average, they will use 156% more energy when cloud gaming is compared to the local gaming. I think this really reinforces a message that we cannot afford to stay put, and we need to start our net zero transitions journey as of now.
Great. Thanks, Xiao. It was a lot of numbers, and I know that it's difficult to take it in. Yesterday, we were reminded to be always asking, when we're setting up comparative scenarios between years and baselines, it's important to call our attention to compared to what, and to define sustainability in terms of what, for whom, and for how long. And so one of the really wonderful things about participating in a group like Playing for the Planet is that we can bring together individuals to have those sticky discussions, because oftentimes we use the same terms and we may be referring to different things. So I wanted to ask Dan to give us a moment of clarity here, because there's, Xiao mentioned the term net zero, and there's so many terms flying around: carbon neutral, climate positive, carbon negative, all of those. Can you help set us straight on some of the basic terminology as people might hear when they are listening to companies making climate commitments in the gaming sector?
I can certainly try my best, Trista. So to all listening, I can appreciate that it can be tricky to remember the nuances of these terms. Don't worry that sometimes I fall foul of myself. But the Play for the Planet Alliance has done a lot to support companies as they learn together so they can set more ambitious goals. So let's talk about those 3 terms, right? So I think it was zero carbon versus net zero versus carbon neutrality. So zero carbon means, well, really no carbon emissions, which is pretty straightforward. Now, you could apply that term to all or individual parts of your business, so long as you're clear in your communications about what you're referring to. So that's the zero carbon. Now, net zero means you may have had emissions, but you are then taking the appropriate actions to mitigate those emissions that impact on the atmosphere, such as things like direct carbon capture. And the last is carbon neutrality. So this refers to measuring your business's carbon footprint based on your operations. So that carbon footprint, or greenhouse gas emissions rather, is then balanced by an action that reduces or eliminates those emissions. And whatever is left is then offset with an action that removes and stores away the carbon. So thankfully, there are online greenhouse gas calculators out there to help you in your measurement journey. So you don't have to start it from scratch. Don't worry about that. Now, net zero goals often have a specific target date. Typically, you'll hear in the press and the media that 2030, 2035 is when a lot of these goals are being set for. So if you're using offsets, then there is a wide variety in purpose and quality out there. And there are also guides and initiatives and can help you select those in an informed way too. And then lastly, I just want to say that if we bring this back to gaming, the first step really is to reduce with things like device improvements, software improvements, maybe switching to a green energy power plan for your offices and operations to actually prevent the emissions from ever even entering the atmosphere in the first place. And then after that, priorities are actions or offsets that sequester carbon, i.e. remove carbon from the atmosphere, like planting trees, direct air capture, and so on. So I hope that helps in explaining the difference there between the different carbon terms.
Yes, thank you a lot, especially because in the Alliance, we've been talking about the actions that companies can take to reduce their footprint in-house so that they eliminate the risk that offsets may not actually create the benefit that they were intended on the landscape. And also because there's that issue of the cost of delayed action. So sometimes offsets can take time to actually sequester that carbon out of the atmosphere, or maybe they may sequester it initially and then in the form of a tree, for example, and the forest burns down, so it releases back to the atmosphere. So even if you are using emissions, it's always better to default to eliminating the emissions from your company's plan in the first place, and then move on to other solutions. There's many tools and tips that can be found in the Yuki Green Game Guide and many of the resources on the Playing for the Planet site also. So now, Josh, if a company wants to get started with these approaches and wants to set some goals, can you tell us about what are some of the things that are making it easier for games businesses to measure their carbon output, and what resources are available to help them start taking action?
Hi, Trista. Yeah, so as you touched upon, I think the Yuki Green Games Guide is actually a really good place to start. Gives a user-friendly summary of kind of what you need to start to think about if you're embarking on this journey. The best guidance out there in terms of a methodology for measuring organizational footprint, for example, is the greenhouse gas protocol, which I think Nick Walker actually mentioned yesterday. This really gives the underlying method that's used for things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for example. And they've actually published a chapter that has specific ICT sector guidance, which is really suitable for many of the companies perhaps watching today within the gaming industry. Well, I think there's perhaps some more specific guidance that could be useful when looking specifically at the gaming industry. But I think that could come in the future, perhaps with a further addition to that guidance. Although it's a good starting point currently when you're looking at this. In terms of data, the Playing for the Planet Alliance actually has a dedicated decarbonisation working group, and they've started to share a sort of common data set for the gaming industry to use to start making those estimates for the kinds of data that have really a lot of gaming companies, perhaps developers, for example, have said are difficult for them to get. And this is things on like product energy use, product manufacturing. So any kind of the scope 3 emissions, which I think we'll touch upon in a second, areas that aren't within your organizational direct emissions, then not your company data, for example, they're harder to get. And that's the kind of data that we're trying to put together in an easy to access format within the Playing for the Planet Alliance. So anyone can access them and start to understand what the impact of, say, playing their games is, or the use of devices is, for example. And these all contribute to your overall emissions.
Thanks, Josh. Dan, Josh just mentioned scope 3, and I promised for the audience to be able to make some of the terminology more understandable? I know that the scope 1, 2, and 3 was mentioned yesterday. Could you give our audience a refresher about what is it that is being referred to when people say scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 when they're talking about carbon footprinting? Can our producers cue up that second slide, please?
I've become something of a walking dictionary definition at the moment, which is good. I'm always happy. Okay, scope 1 to 3. So accounting for greenhouse gas emissions is, first of all, it's a pretty crucial first step that companies have to take to begin that decarbonisation journey. And GHGs, greenhouse gases, are emitted from different sources across a company's value chain. So in order to simplify the accounting process, these are divided, as you can see on the screen, into scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And it's good to know that each can be tackled separately. Now, at a high level, scope 1 emissions are direct emissions of the company, typically things like fuel combustion, like cars, planes, trucks, generators, and so on. So it's best to think of it as fuel combustion for scope 1. There are nuances to each one, but that's a general good starting point. So scope 2 and 3 emissions are outside of the company and probably apply to all of you, whereas scope 1 might not apply to all of you. So scope 2 would be purchased electricity for your company's own use, like the electricity powering your offices, PCs, dev kits, or even the electricity powering the cooling of your server blades, for example. So if you're already powered entirely by renewable energy, then that's great. That's a really good start for scope 2. Now, scope 3 is more fun. I guess it's kind of like the final boss fight in your game that you've been leveling up this fight, leveling up for this fight the whole time, right? So scope 3 is indirect emissions and covers things like production of purchased materials, waste disposal, what else? Employee business travel, and perhaps, I guess most interestingly, it would be the use of sold products or services. So in my case, working in Xbox, the electricity used to power all our Xbox consoles are a great example of scope 3. So yeah, I hope that helps with the scope 1 to 3 definition, Trista.
Yeah, it's a great reminder to everyone, and also the analogy that you're saying about leveling up is apt, because so many of the companies have done a lot on their using all of the resources that they have at hand, and then they're looking to collaborate with others to reach the next level. So Josh, could you tell us about if a company is just getting its start, where should they first focus when they're starting to calculate their organizational footprint in the schema that Dan just laid out?
Sure. So Dan did a great job of explaining the different scopes there. And scope 1 is perhaps and usually the most easy data that a company can collect. These are the direct data from your organization that are kind of readily available to most people. And say, for example, for a gaming developer, the energy used in your offices, for example. You can easily get this, and that tells you a lot, mainly about your scope 1. And then scope 3 is a lot more difficult, but it likely represents the majority of the impact for most companies. And so this, as Dan said, it would include all energy consumed by devices playing games, as well as the embodied energy to produce those devices playing them, and perhaps things like internet use to download, stream, or cloud stream a game. So it can be really hard to know where to start here, but as the scope 3 does have largest share of the impact, it's really important to kind of focus on the hotspots within that scope 3, and mostly these usually come from the kind of production footprint of devices, as well as the energy used by those products when you're gaming. And a great place to start really is to understand how many of the games are being used, for how long, and on which platforms they're being played on, for example. If we know that information, then Playing for the Planet Alliance actually has now starting to build up a database or a shared set of data that we can use to turn those the information that you have about number of gamers or number of games on different devices into estimates for carbon emissions, because we have the data for energy used by PlayStation and Xbox consoles when gaming. And now Microsoft has just completed, I'm sure Dan can speak more about it, a kind of assessment of mobile gaming and the power consumed by phones to game. We also have all the other kind of difficult things like energy used by the internet as well. And we've also started to try and form that into a tool that companies can use to put in a simple set of assumptions about the different types of games or specific scenarios that are relevant to them, and build a calculation that suits them to calculate a scope 3. But the biggest thing, as I said, is kind of this energy used by devices and the manufacturing footprint. And so really getting a good understanding of that to start is really important. There can be sort of diminishing returns if you're looking at smaller contributors to your overall footprint. So if you're kind of perhaps starting off going into really loads of detail about things like maybe some distribution elements or fine details on logistics, might not be the best spend of energy when you're initially starting out, given that using kind of simple data about how many games are played on different devices, for example, that can be within the sort of company data that many gaming developers have, for example, we can turn that into an estimate that represents probably the largest source of impact or the greatest hotspot within the organizational footprint.
Awesome, thanks. You mentioned a number of things. One, which has been very useful to me, is having a peer network professionally that's reading the literature as I am, that's passing on nuggets of information, that's comparing experiences, and so that we can learn off of each other. I've seen many young company new to carbon footprinting come into Playing for the Planet Alliance and receive a whole lot of peer support and empathy in wading through a lot of very difficult data territory. And that's allowed them to kind of launch quickly into more effective action and also help get guided towards some of those hotspots that might be most relevant for their company, so that they can take the resources that they have and get the most bang out of their buck in terms of making a difference for the climate with the efforts that they have. And to that point, Josh, you mentioned that each of us that have worked on footprinting over long periods of time always run into this point of diminishing returns. How to know what you should do, or when to know when you have run into a wall where for every additional effort you put in to get more data, you get less and less benefit out of. And that's a very frustrating place to be if you're only learning from your own experience. This is where peer support and collaboration is really crucial to identifying that point, and then also leapfrogging. So Dan, can you tell me a bit about that? What happens when, if you're working on a footprint, you've run into a data wall, or if you as a game studio have taken all of the action that you can and you don't know where to go next, or if the next step is going to be worth investing, what would you say in advice to them?
Firstly, no matter how small you might think your business is, I would say everyone can definitely play a part. So it might be easy to get daunted and intimidated by the scope of these projects, but I promise you, once you get stuck in, it's not as difficult as you might think. And even if it's influencing others to do the same, then that's a great help. So I guess first part would be start by joining something like the Play for the Planet Alliance to learn more. As they say, a problem shared is a problem solved, and there are lots of very wise and learned people to get inspired by and learn from, such as Xiao, Josh, and Trista, who are all here obviously. Learned a lot from these folks. A great example about how to maybe solve a challenge that Josh mentioned earlier, right, was the mobile study, where our mobile game developer friends in the Playing for the Planet Alliance needed help better understanding watt hours used by the top phones on the market when playing specifically their games. So coupled with usage numbers and emissions factors, this would help them in figuring out or starting to figure out their scope 3 emissions accounting. So we went and got the top 12 or 15 most popular phones on the market and played their games over a period of time and made lab measurements for the exact watt hours required to recharge the battery after 30 minutes of gameplay. That set them on their road, hopefully, to start figuring out their own carbon accounting for scope 3. So I think that all started from being part of an alliance to better understand and learn from new things. The other thing I just want to add here as well is, I guess, just knowing your greenhouse gas emissions can help prepare your company to effectively undertake opportunities as the whole world transitions to a net zero emissions economy. So just having that ability to be able to identify business opportunities such as cost savings through things like energy efficiency measures can offer that increased competitive advantage by offering products or services with a lower GHG impact. And remember, don't forget that customers and clients are becoming increasingly concerned about climate impacts of the products and services they purchase, and they're more likely to embrace more sustainable products and services. So I think that's why it's important. So don't get daunted. Seek out the Play for the Planet Alliance, ask for help, read materials, and absolutely everyone from one designer in their bedroom after work when they're just building themselves a game to the biggest companies in the world can all make a difference in their own way.
Those are great points, Dan. And what I hear you touching on is the fact that just getting data awareness, using so many of the tools that Josh pointed out, is enough to stimulate innovation in many cases. That's one piece, and that can really lend itself to the business sense of making this investment. A second point that was made is that the involvement, that once you get better transparency for your own company, then that opens the door to involvement from all levels of your company to help you bring down things that are real business costs, energy, infrastructure, and direct contact with your gamers and clients, as well as suppliers. These are all things that can be improved through better transparency. And to be able to have visibility on what your footprint looks like means that you can open doors to collaboration on your footprint to your whole workforce, from the newest employee all the way up to executive leadership. And that is a key to staff retention, especially as increasingly younger workforces are really identifying with companies that are value driven, especially for issues that they care a lot about, like the climate. So we are nearing the end of our session. I wanted to touch back again with Xiao, because we are trying also in the games industry to learn from other experiences of other industries. And one of your experiences at DTU is the work that you've led with data centers. And I know that along the way you've picked up different lessons and different approaches. So what can you tell us about some of the broader tools that we can use to build a greener gaming industry? Can you tell us a bit more? I know that there was some mention earlier of greenhouse gas protocol approaches and other pieces that you may wish to mention.
Well, I think my answer to this is based on my observation for our discussion today, I realized we discussed a lot of data collection actions from the company side, from the industry side. To me, it's more like the bottom up, where we can do as a voluntary actions. But I think there's also some of these top-down tools or mechanisms could help to address the issues. For example, the standards. Because personally, I think the decarbonization or sustainability in general is moving from a niche topic to a new normal. So we're now really in a new paradigm. And it's really forcing us to look at whether we're having now, as a reporting schemes is delivering their promises. Are we having the type of impact that we need in order to reach the net zero goals that we need to reach, as the UNEP UN experts telling us to? So to answer that, we need to discuss about the standards. But first, I want to clarify, there comes with two types of standards. One is the greenhouse gas protocols we have talked about today, and one is the industry standards. And then there are differences between these two sets of standards. So when we talk about a protocol, we are talking about a defined set of rules that are used by two or more companies in order to interact between themselves. But only when the protocol is formalized and accepted by most of the parties to implement it, then it becomes the industry standards. The greenhouse gas protocols, for example, the ones that we have on the corporate value chains, is important because it allows the companies to assess their entire value chain emissions impact and identify where to focus reduction activities, like to help the business to understand the risks and associated opportunities in terms of their carbon reduction or net zero transitions. But it only enables the comparison of a company's own GHG emissions over time. It is not designed to support comparison among the companies based on their Scope 3 emissions. So this is more used as a short-term wise to deliver positive returns for the companies or the businesses on investment. According to the data, up to 90% of an organization's environmental impact lies in the value chain. So if we could have the tools like the greenhouse gas protocols to help us to analyze and take actions on the business value chain, then we could help the business to be better prepared for a low carbon economy. We're in a new sustainability paradigms. But long-term wise, we need something for the market, and that comes in the industry-specific standards comes into the pictures. And the benefits of doing so are extensive, like the industry standards could help to improve the market access because of the increased competitiveness and efficiency, reduce the trading cost and improve the product qualities. It can help to improve the relations between suppliers and clients because of the improved safeties. And it can also provide easier access of the greener innovative products, because provided by the interoperabilities and because of the newly adopted eco-designs for energy efficiency solutions. And last but not least, it also helped to bridge this gap between research to marketable products onto the market. So I would say that when we look at standards, the tools to use, we should look at two folds. One is the greenhouse gas protocols for short-term wise to help the business to have better returns on their investment, and at the same time also have a carbon reductions. And long-term wise, the industry standards help us to build a greener market for sustainable futures with net zero pathways.
Things about the Playing for the Planet Alliance has also been that we've been able to explore some places of public-private partnership that have been unaddressed in the past that let us do more in terms of greening our approaches. So, for example, I know with a few of you on this panel, I've commiserated in the past about how difficult it has been to get a hold of information about the grid mix, about where gamers are playing their games and how much of that grid is actually renewable or not. And that's one of those things that public policy can really help with. If we form a quorum amongst the green game industry and say this information is needed, it's important to gamers, it's important to all of us in order to reduce our Scope 3 emissions, and this should be free and available to all, that's something that's almost a standard that public policy could help cultivate in the energy field, so that more information was available both to consumers in their households as well as to the game designers that are using it to deliver a greener product. So there's lots of ways in which this can be interpreted. There's so much room for discussion on this topic. I know we're just on the cusp of lots of different innovations and working harder to tackle this really wild beast of the Scope 3 emissions together. And I think together is a really crucial piece, because one-on-one, no company can do it alone, but together I think we're really making inroads on this. This is the end of our panel for today. Next panel up is the Green Code session, which will also be talking a lot about a lot of really exciting innovations and also representation from different parts of the world. Thanks so much.